Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to talk to you about towns and cities and urbanization in general, because more and more people live in urban areas. According to the UN, by 2008, 50% of the world's population lived in towns and cities. And by 2030, 60% of the world's population would be urbanized. The other thing the UN said in their report was that most of the growth in urban dwelling was in the third world. And when I say most, I mean 95% of growth in the last 10 or 15 years had been in cities in the third world. And all the biggest cities in the world are now in developing or emerging countries. For instance, in 2008, Bombay had a population of 17 million, which is expected to go up to more than 22 million by 2018. Shanghai has a population of about 15 or 16 million. And I could go on like this with other examples. The UN expects the third world to continue growing in urbanization for the next 20 years, and 80% of the growth in cities in the next 20 years is going to be in third world countries. Now, it's rather hard for many Europeans to imagine what it's like living in a city of 15 or 20 million people. I mean, it's bigger than the population of most EU member states. Personally, having briefly lived in Calcutta, I have a pretty good idea of what living in a city of that size feels like, and it's not actually very pleasant. However, it does seem to be what awaits most people in the world, and so perhaps we should stop and think a little bit about urbanization and what it entails. And think about also what drives urbanization, and perhaps for that we need to go back in history and think about what drove the creation of towns and cities initially. And the funniest thing about this is that actually, in order for cities to exist, for towns to exist, you need the rural areas to function properly and deliver a surplus. People in towns can't feed themselves, so somebody has to grow the food for them. Therefore, ironically, urbanization is dependent on successful agriculture and agricultural practice. And so it wasn't until our ancient ancestors developed good agricultural techniques that they were able to start creating towns and cities. They needed to provide enough food for everyone to generate a surplus. The other thing they needed to do, of course, was to be able to transport that food efficiently and relatively quickly to cities. And that meant that in addition to developing agriculture, they also had to develop transport. So they had to start having efficient roads, and basically they had to invent the wheel, because until you had the wheel, it was virtually impossible in most countries to get food quickly, or reasonably quickly, for more than a few kilometers. The other way in which they transported food, of course, was on waterways, particularly rivers. And that's why most of the big towns and cities grew up along the great rivers, along the Nile or in the Tigris and Euphrates basins in what is now Iraq. And that is indeed where a lot of the cities began to appear, at least as far as we know. It seems that the oldest recorded city is Jericho, whose walls, as you remember, came tumbling down, but not before it had grown to be a very large metropolis. And really, since then, the growth in urbanization has been tied closely to transport links and food production. However, it's worth pointing out that in the early Middle Ages, the size of cities stagnated because they reached a kind of critical size beyond which they could not grow based on the current available technology and know-how. And this was, in particular, due to hygiene problems, because when large groups of people congregated in one place, sewage and other problems began to emerge and threaten health and hygiene. And there were epidemics. And so there was a sort of natural mechanism to limit the growth of cities, which was basically that half the people died of cholera or diarrhea or any other kind of nasty illness that you can imagine from people living in slums, which is basically what the vast majority of people were doing. And so cities didn't grow beyond probably a few thousand citizens for many years, until there was the next boost to city growth and urbanization, which was basically the Industrial Revolution. With the Industrial Revolution, several things happened. Food production became more efficient due to modern technology, not least the steam engine. Factories were built, and these factories, built for industrial goods production, needed a lot of workers. It made sense to bring people in from the countryside to live all together in the areas where those factories were. So that generated city growth. And finally, transport improved because of the steam engine, because of railways. So there was a big burst in urbanization in the 18th and 19th centuries, starting, of course, in the UK, because we were the first country to industrialize. And that then took cities to the next stage, but they were still way short of what a modern-sized city would be. And 200 years ago, only about a quarter of the world's population lived in urban centers, and there were only about 90 towns worldwide that had a population of more than 100,000. So it was still quite small. And even in the 1950s, there were only 2 really big metropolises of several million inhabitants, London and New York. How times have changed. And what's really changed is what's happening now. It's the growth, the exponential growth in third world countries. And that's really something that started in the 70s and 80s, but that really, really took off in the 1990s. It's since then that there's been this third boom, you could say, in urbanization, this mass exodus from the rural areas into urban areas. And it's happening, as I've said, mainly in third world countries. And again, it's creating the same problem as we had back in the Middle Ages, which is that most of the growth is in slums. Whether or not this means that the growth will then run out of momentum because the slums will create the kinds of problems and epidemics I mentioned before, and that this will sort of limit their scope for growth, whether or not that actually happens this time is unlikely, in my view, because nowadays we do have a certain amount of technology to prevent those epidemics from getting out of hand. What is more likely to happen is that many of these cities will be pools of human misery, to put it rather bluntly. The majority of people flocking into them will live miserable existences in horrible conditions. They won't die. They will be able to eke out a living. That living might even be better than the living they'd make back on the farm or village they came from. But it will not be in proper living conditions, in proper health and hygiene. They probably won't be able to get a proper education for their kids, who will thus be trapped in this cycle of urban degradation and poverty. And in case you think that it's a pity, but maybe it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, I will point out one last thing, which is that cycles of urban degradation and poverty lead to unrest as well as disease. Unrest leads to war, coups, and even if you live in a more comfortable city in Western Europe, unrest in a third world city can lead to a flood of refugees coming into your nice, pristine environment and causing you or your neighbors all sorts of problems which you may not enjoy dealing with. Thank you.